The taxi's headlights swept across the familiar driveway as Maggie Thompson returned from her weekend visit with her old college friend in Vermont. She'd expected to see the porch light glowing warmly, welcoming her home after 3 peaceful days of reminiscing and hiking through autumn foliage. Instead, darkness greeted her. As she stepped out of the car, something felt wrong. The house stood silent, its windows black and unwelcoming. Then she saw them, her belongings scattered across the front porch like discarded memories. Her favorite reading lamp lay on its side next to the door. The suitcase she'd left in the closet sat open, half packed with clothes she hadn't taken on her trip. Maggie's heart hammered as she approached the porch. Taped to her framed wedding photo was a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, recognizing Brandon's neat handwriting. "Sorry, Mom. No space for you anymore?" No signature, no explanation. Oh, just 6 words that felt like a death sentence. She stood frozen, the paper fluttering in the evening breeze. This was her house, the home she'd shared with her late husband Bob, where she'd raised Brandon as a single mother after Bob's heart attack 12 years ago. The place where she'd nursed scraped knees, celebrated birthdays, and built a life from the ruins of widowhood. The taxi driver honked impatiently. Maggie carefully gathered her scattered belongings, her movements mechanical. She placed the wedding photo gently in her suitcase, wrapped the lamp in a throw pillow, and picked up the house keys that had been left mockingly on the doormat. As she walked back to the taxi, she didn't cry. She didn't pound on the door or call out for her son. There was a strange clarity in the shock, a crystalline moment of understanding that her life had just irrevocably changed. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. Maggie looked back at the house one last time. A curtain twitched in the upstairs window, Brandon's old room. Someone was watching her leave. "The YMCA downtown," she said quietly, settling into the back seat with her life packed into 2 small bags. The YMCA's lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and tired hope. Maggie sat in a plastic chair, filling out forms for a temporary room. Around her, other displaced people waited with their own stories of loss and survival. The small room on the 3rd floor had a single bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the parking lot. Maggie set her suitcase down and sat on the thin mattress, finally allowing herself to process what had happened. She thought about Bob, how he'd worried about leaving her and Brandon alone. "Take care of your mother," he'd whispered to their son during those final hospital days. Brandon had been 22 then, struggling to finish college while watching his father die. He'd promised. For 12 years, they'd lived together in relative harmony. Brandon had his own life, his job at the insurance company, his girlfriend Chelsea. But he'd always been there for Maggie, helping with repairs, sharing quiet dinners, occasionally watching old movies together on Sunday evenings. When had that changed? When had she become a burden instead of his mother? Maggie pulled out her phone and noticed 17 missed calls from Brandon. No voicemails, no texts, just repeated attempts to reach her, as if he'd suddenly realized what he'd done. She turned off the phone and placed it in the drawer. Tomorrow, she would start looking for answers. Tonight, she would mourn the son she thought she knew. Outside, the city hummed with life while Maggie Thompson sat in her temporary room, surrounded by the fragments of her former existence, and planned her next move. The next morning, Maggie walked through her old neighborhood, not quite ready to confront the house, but needing to understand what had happened. 3 blocks away, she found her answer. Brandon's car sat in the driveway of a modest colonial she'd never seen before. Through the large front window, she could see him and Chelsea sitting at a dining table, papers spread between them. Chelsea was animated, pointing at documents while Brandon nodded reluctantly. Maggie moved closer. Careful to stay behind the hedges, she could see real estate brochures, floor plans, and what looked like legal documents. Chelsea held up a photograph of their house. Maggie's house, and smiled triumphantly. This wasn't a sudden decision born of frustration or desperation. This was planned, calculated. They'd been preparing for this moment, probably for months. Brandon's shoulders were slumped in the familiar way they'd been when he was a teenager facing consequences for breaking curfew. But he wasn't a teenager anymore. He was 34 years old, making adult decisions about his mother's life without including her in the conversation. Chelsea leaned over and kissed his cheek, then returned to the papers with renewed energy. She was the driving force. Maggie realized Brandon was following, not leading. As Maggie watched her son and his girlfriend discuss her future as if she were already dead, something hardened inside her chest. The grief and confusion of the previous night crystallized into something sharper determination. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't called in years. Pat Williams, her former colleague from the insurance company. Pat had retired to part-time legal consulting, specializing in helping women navigate complex family situations. If Brandon and Chelsea wanted to play with legal documents, Maggie would learn the rules of their game. Pat Williams' office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house downtown. The waiting room held the comfortable chaos of a woman who'd spent 40 years in law stacks of legal journals, family photos, and a coffee maker that looked older than Brandon. "Maggie Thompson," Pat said, emerging from her office with a warm smile that quickly faded when she saw her old colleague's expression. "You look like you've been through hell." They settled into Pat's office, where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows. Maggie told her story without embellishment, watching Pat's face grow increasingly grim. "Show me the note," Pat said. Maggie handed over Brandon's message. Pat examined it like evidence, which, Maggie realized, it was. "This is constructive eviction," Pat said finally. "What you're describing, removing your belongings, changing locks, creating a hostile environment, it's illegal if you have legitimate residency rights. Tell me about the house ownership." "It's in my name," Maggie said. "Bob and I bought it together, but when he died, it transferred to me completely. Brandon was never on the deed." Pat's eyebrows rose. "Never? Not even as a beneficiary?" "We discussed it once. Bob thought it was important for Brandon to make his own way, not inherit his life. We figured he'd get the house eventually, but not until I was gone." "And you've been paying all the bills, taxes, insurance, maintenance?" "Everything. Brandon contributes to groceries and utilities, but the house itself is my responsibility." Pat leaned back in her chair. "Maggie, what your son did isn't just cruel, it's potentially criminal. If he's trying to claim ownership rights he doesn't have, if he's forged your name on any documents, if he's attempting to defraud you of your property—" She shook her head. "This could get very ugly very quickly." "I don't want to destroy him," Maggie said quietly. "I just want to understand what's happening." "Understanding is the first step toward protecting yourself," Pat replied. "But you need to be prepared for the possibility that protection might require consequences. Do you have access to the original property documents?" Maggie nodded. "There's a filing cabinet in the basement. I have keys. We need to get those documents before anyone else does. And we need to check for any recent activity on your property credit checks, loan applications, anything that might suggest someone's been using your name without permission." Pat reached for her phone. "I'm calling Sarah Coleman. She's an attorney who specializes in elder law and property rights. If there's fraud involved, you'll need more than just moral support." As Pat dialed, Maggie felt something shift inside her. For the first time since finding her belongings on the porch, she wasn't just reacting to what had been done to her. She was taking action. At 2 a.m, Maggie used her key to enter the house that had been her home for 23 years. The silence felt different now, hostile rather than peaceful. She moved carefully through the darkness, knowing every creaking board and obstacle by heart. The basement filing cabinet was exactly where she'd left it. Inside, she found the original deed, property tax records, and insurance documents. But as she photographed each page with her phone, something caught her attention. Several recent utility bills had been filed in the cabinet, but they weren't addressed to her. Brandon Thompson and Chelsea Martinez appeared on the electric bill. Chelsea Martinez was listed as the primary contact for the water service. Her name had been systematically removed from the utilities serving her own home. Maggie's hands shook as she photographed the evidence. She found more a homeowner's insurance policy change form with her forged signature, redirecting all communications to Chelsea's email address. A property tax appeal that she'd never filed, also bearing her forged name. The forgeries were skilled but not perfect. The M in Margaret was slightly too angular. The T in Thompson lacked her characteristic flourish. Chelsea had practiced her signature, but not well enough to fool someone who'd been writing it for 62 years. In the bottom drawer, she found something that made her blood freeze: a copy of a quitclaim deed, unsigned but filled out to transfer the property from Margaret Thompson to Brandon Thompson and Chelsea Martinez as joint tenants. The document was dated 3 months ago, waiting only for her signature to make it official. Her phone buzzed with a text from Pat. "Everything okay? You've been there 2 hours." Maggie typed back, "Found everything. It's worse than we thought." She photographed the quitclaim deed and was about to close the filing cabinet when she noticed something else: a letter from a mortgage company addressed to Brandon, offering pre-approval for a home equity loan against the property. The application listed him as the homeowner and included copies of forged documents supporting his claim. They weren't just trying to evict her. They were trying to steal her house entirely, probably to cash out its equity for their own purposes. Maggie climbed the stairs one last time, pausing at the kitchen where she'd packed thousands of lunches, the living room where she'd rocked Brandon through countless childhood illnesses, the bedroom where she'd grieved her husband and slowly learned to live alone. At the front door, she turned back for one final look. The house felt like a crime scene now, contaminated by betrayal and lies. Whatever happened next, she knew she could never live here again. The walls held too many secrets, too much pain. Outside, Pat's car waited in the driveway. Her friend had insisted on driving her, worried about Maggie's emotional state. As they pulled away, Maggie saw a light come on in the upstairs window, Brandon's old room, where he'd apparently been sleeping while she was away. He'd been in the house the whole time, listening to her move through the basement, knowing she was discovering his betrayal, and he'd done nothing to stop her or explain himself. "How bad is it?" Pat asked. Maggie looked at the phone full of evidence. They've been planning this for months. Forged signatures, fake documents, attempts to remortgage the house. They're not just trying to kick me out. They're trying to steal everything I have. Pat's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Then we're not just protecting your home anymore. We're preventing a crime. The next morning brought revelations that complicated everything. Maggie was having coffee with Pat when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street from the house. "Margaret, dear, I hope you don't mind me calling." Mrs. Chen said, "I saw you leave very early this morning, and I wanted to make sure everything was all right. There's been so much arguing coming from your house lately." Arguing. Maggie's stomach tightened. Yes, Brandon and that girl of his. Last night was particularly bad. She was screaming about money, about how they needed to make this work, or she'd leave. Poor Brandon was crying, actually crying. I've never seen a grown man so upset. Maggie thanked Mrs. Chen and hung up, her mind racing. She turned to Pat. "I need to understand what's driving this. Brandon's not cruel by nature. Something's pushing him." Pat nodded. "Financial pressure makes people do terrible things. Should we do some investigating? They spent the morning at the courthouse, pulling public records. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Brandon had been laid off from his insurance job 6 months ago, but had told no one. He'd been living on unemployment benefits and credit cards, falling deeper into debt each month. Worse, there were medical bills in Chelsea's name expensive ones. Pat's contacts in the medical community confirmed what the bills suggested: Chelsea was pregnant, but there were complications requiring specialized care. "He's desperate," Pat said, studying the financial records. "A baby on the way, no job, mounting debts. In his mind, your house isn't just shelter, it's the only asset he has access to." That evening, Maggie did something she'd never done before. She parked across the street from the house and watched. Through the lit windows, she could see Brandon and Chelsea's relationship dynamics playing out like a silent movie. Chelsea was animated, aggressive, pointing at papers spread across the kitchen table. Brandon sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. When he looked up, his face was streaked with tears. Chelsea threw down a pen and stormed out of the kitchen. Brandon followed, his posture pleading. Through the living room window, Maggie could see him reaching for Chelsea's hands while she pulled away. The front door opened. Chelsea stood on the porch, suitcase in hand, shouting something back at Brandon. He came out after her, still crying, still begging. "If you can't make this happen," Chelsea's voice carried across the quiet street, "then I can't do this anymore. I'm not raising a baby in poverty because you can't stand up to your mother." "She's not just my mother," Brandon said, his voice breaking. "She's the only family I have left." "Then choose," Chelsea snapped. "Her or us, the house or your child, because I'm done waiting for you to grow up." She got in her car and drove away, leaving Brandon standing alone on the porch. He stood there for a long time, staring at the street, before finally going back inside. Maggie sat in her car, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just about greed or cruelty. Brandon was being torn apart by impossible choices, manipulated by a woman who saw his mother as an obstacle to their future. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. It didn't justify the forged signatures, the lies, the betrayal. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant he'd known how wrong it was and had done it anyway. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Mom, please call me. I know you're angry, but we need to talk." Maggie stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Tomorrow, she would call Sarah Coleman and begin the legal process of protecting her rights. Tonight, she would mourn the son she'd thought she knew, the one who would never choose his mother over his own convenience, who would fight for what was right instead of what was easy. But she also understood something else. Brandon wasn't just her betrayer. He was also a victim, trapped between his conscience and his desperation, manipulated by someone who'd made him believe that destroying his mother was the only way to save his future. The knowledge didn't change what she had to do, but it changed how she would do it. Sarah Coleman's office was nothing like the sterile corporate environments Maggie had expected. Located in a converted brownstone, it felt more like a living room than a law firm. Family photos, children's artwork, and inspirational quotes created an atmosphere of warmth and safety. Sarah herself was younger than Maggie had expected, probably in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes that had clearly seen too much pain. She listened to Maggie's story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "I specialize in cases like yours," Sarah said when Maggie finished. "Elder financial abuse is more common than people think, and family members are the perpetrators about 60% of the time. The dynamics you're describing, the gradual isolation, the document manipulation, the psychological pressure, it's textbook." She pulled out a thick folder. "Let me show you what we're dealing with legally. Your son and his girlfriend have committed several crimes: forgery, identity theft, attempted fraud, and constructive eviction. The quitclaim deed alone could result in felony charges. Maggie winced. I don't want to send my son to prison. I understand, Sarah said gently. But you need to understand the severity of what's been done to you. They've tried to steal your home, your identity, your financial security. The law takes this seriously because it's not just about property. It's about your fundamental right to exist. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up a document. I'm going to file a cease and desist order today. This will legally notify Brandon and Chelsea that any further attempts to use your name, access your accounts, or claim ownership of your property will result in immediate prosecution. What happens next? We file a police report about the forgery. We notify the mortgage company that the loan application was fraudulent. We place a freeze on your property so no one can sell it or borrow against it without your presence at the transaction. Sarah's expression grew serious. But you need to be prepared for Brandon's response. Right now, he probably thinks you don't know about the legal documents. When he realizes you've discovered everything and taken action, he might escalate. Escalate how? He might file a counterclaim, arguing that you're mentally incompetent or that he has some right to the property. He might claim you gave him permission verbally. He might even argue that you're the one who's been forging signatures. Maggie felt a chill. Would anyone believe that the burden of proof would be on him? Sarah said. But family legal battles can get ugly quickly. Are you prepared for that possibility? Maggie thought about Brandon crying on the porch, about Chelsea's ultimatum, about the years of single motherhood that had taught her to fight for what mattered. I'm prepared to protect myself, she said firmly. I've spent 12 years taking care of everyone else. It's time I took care of me. Sarah smiled the first genuine smile Maggie had seen from her. Good, because this is going to require strength and patience. We're not just fighting for your house. We're fighting for your right to exist as an independent person. As they discussed strategy, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. Not the passive hope that things would return to normal, but the active hope that comes from taking control of an impossible situation. When she left Sarah's office, she had a plan, a legal advocate, and most importantly, a clear understanding of what she was fighting for. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to live without fear in her own home. The cease and desist letter was delivered on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Maggie's phone was ringing constantly with calls from Brandon that she refused to answer. By Wednesday, she understood why. Sarah called with news that made Maggie's stomach sink. Brandon has retained an attorney, Richard Hawthorne from Palmer & Associates. It's a good firm, expensive. This isn't someone scraping together money for a consultation. This is serious legal representation. How can he afford that if he's unemployed? Maggie asked. That's what concerns me. Someone's funding this, and I suspect it's not Brandon. Hawthorne filed a response to our cease and desist, claiming that his client has been acting as your caretaker and has implied authority to manage your affairs. Maggie sat down heavily. Implied authority. He's arguing that you're elderly, possibly not competent to manage your own finances, and that Brandon has been acting in your best interests. He's also claiming that you gave verbal permission for the utility transfers and that any signatures in question were done with your knowledge. That's not true. I know it's not true. But it's a clever strategy. If he can create doubt about your mental competency, he can argue that everything he did was legitimate caregiving, not fraud. Sarah's voice grew more serious. There's more. Hawthorne has filed a motion for a competency evaluation. He wants a court-appointed psychiatrist to examine you to determine if you're capable of managing your own affairs. Maggie felt the world tilt. They're trying to have me declared incompetent. It's a desperation move, but it's also dangerous. If they can convince a judge that you're not mentally sound, they could potentially gain guardianship over you and legal control of your assets. That night, Maggie barely slept. She kept thinking about the cruel irony Brandon's attempt to steal her home had now escalated to an attempt to steal her identity entirely. If he succeeded, she wouldn't just lose her house, she'd lose her legal right to make decisions about her own life. The next morning brought worse news. Pat called from the courthouse, where she'd been monitoring filings in Maggie's case. "They've found a witness," Pat said grimly. "Mrs. Henderson from next door. She's filed an affidavit saying that you seemed confused and forgetful in recent months, that Brandon was clearly taking care of you, and that you told her you were thinking about signing the house over to him." Maggie's hands shook. Mrs. Henderson had been their neighbor for 15 years, but they'd never been close. "I never said that. I barely talked to her, except to wave hello. Doesn't matter. It's on paper now, and it supports their narrative. Maggie, this is getting serious. They're not just trying to steal your house anymore. They're trying to steal your life." As Maggie hung up, she realized that the son she'd raised, the boy she'd sacrificed everything for, was now prepared to have her declared mentally incompetent to get what he wanted. The betrayal was complete. The meeting took place in Sarah's office on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a settlement. Brandon arrived with his attorney, Richard Hawthorne, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Chelsea wasn't there. "She's not feeling well," Brandon explained, avoiding his mother's eyes. "The pregnancy has been difficult." Maggie studied her son's face. Maggie studied. He looked older, haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that made him fidget with his phone. This wasn't the confident young man who'd thrown her belongings on the porch. This was someone who'd been pushed too far and was desperately trying to find a way back. "Before we begin," Sarah said, "I want to make something clear. My client is the sole legal owner of the property in question. Any claims to the contrary are unsupported by documentation and potentially criminal." Hawthorne smiled condescendingly. "Ms. Coleman, my client isn't claiming ownership. He's claiming guardianship responsibility. Mrs. Thompson's recent behavior, the secretive meetings, the defensive posture, the inability to recognize that her family was trying to help her all suggest cognitive decline." "I'm sitting right here," Maggie said quietly. "You can address me directly." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Can you tell me what year it is?" Sarah's hand shot up. "Don't answer that. This isn't a competency hearing, and Dr. Hawthorne isn't qualified to conduct one." "It's Mr. Hawthorne," the attorney corrected. "And I'm simply trying to establish that my client's actions were motivated by legitimate concern for his mother's well-being." Maggie had heard enough. She opened her purse and pulled out a folder, spreading its contents across the conference table. Copies of the forged signatures, the fake quitclaim deed, the mortgage application, the utility transfers, everything she'd discovered in her midnight visit to the house. "Brandon," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest, "did you forge my signature on these documents?" For the first time since entering the room, Brandon looked directly at his mother. His face crumpled. "Mom, Answer the question," Hawthorne said sharply. "Don't say anything without—" "Yes," Brandon whispered. "Chelsea said it was the only way. She said you'd never agree to help us, that you'd rather see us homeless than give up any control." "And did you apply for a mortgage on my house without my knowledge?" "We were desperate. The baby's due in 4 months' pay, and I lost my job. Chelsea's medical bills are astronomical. I thought maybe if I could get enough money to get us stable, I could pay it back before you found out." Hawthorne was furious. "Brandon, stop talking immediately." But Brandon couldn't stop. Months of guilt and fear poured out of him. I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to borrow against the house equity. But then, Chelsea said it would be easier if we just transferred ownership temporarily. She said it was normal for families to do that for tax purposes. And when did transferring ownership temporarily become throwing me out of my own home? Brandon's voice broke. When you came back early from Vermont. We weren't ready. The papers weren't signed yet, and Chelsea panicked. She said if you found out before everything was legal, you'd kick us both out and we'd lose everything. So you chose to kick me out instead. I chose to be a coward, Brandon said, tears streaming down his face. I chose the easy path instead of the honest one. I chose to protect my future instead of protecting the woman who raised me. Hawthorne gathered his papers. This meeting is over. My client was clearly under duress when he made these statements. Your client just admitted to multiple felonies, Sarah said. I'd advise him to think very carefully about his next move. As they prepared to leave, Brandon turned back to his mother. Mom, I know you'll never forgive me, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I got so scared of losing everything that I ended up losing the most important thing of all. Maggie looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw not the man who'd betrayed her, but the frightened boy who'd watched his father die and spent his whole adult life trying to avoid that kind of loss again. I love you too, Brandon, she said quietly, but love isn't enough anymore. The stress of the legal battle finally caught up with Maggie 3 days later. She was in her YMCA room, reviewing documents for the competency hearing. When the chest pains started, the emergency room doctor was young, efficient, and concerned. Your blood pressure is dangerously high, and your stress levels are off the charts. When did you last eat a full meal? Maggie couldn't remember. The past weeks had been a blur of legal meetings, sleepless nights, and the constant anxiety of fighting for her own existence. I'm admitting you for observation, the doctor said. Your heart is under tremendous strain. If you don't find a way to manage this stress, you could have a stroke or heart attack. As Maggie lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IV lines, she felt the weight of defeat settling over her. Maybe Brandon was right. Maybe she was too old for this fight. Maybe it would be easier to just give up, sign the papers, and find a small apartment somewhere. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Mom, I heard you were in the hospital. Please let me come see you. I need to explain everything. An hour later, he sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, looking as exhausted as she felt. I fired Hawthorne, he said quietly. I can't do this anymore. The lying, the legal games, the idea that I might have you declared incompetent, it's insane. Then why did you do it? Because I was drowning, and Chelsea convinced me that you were a life preserver instead of a person. She made me believe that taking care of you was the same as taking from you. Brandon leaned forward. She's gone, Mom. Left yesterday when I told her I was dropping the legal case. Took all her things and moved back to her sister's place in Portland. And the baby? I don't know if it's even mine anymore. I don't know if it ever was. His voice was hollow. I destroyed my relationship with my mother for a woman who was willing to abandon me the moment I grew a conscience. Maggie felt a surge of pity for her son, but also a strange sense of relief. The fight was over. But not because she'd given up. It was over because Brandon had finally chosen to stop fighting against her. What happens now? She asked. Now I try to figure out how to live with what I've done, and hope that someday, maybe, you'll let me try to earn your trust back. The next morning brought Sarah to the hospital with news that changed everything. She sat beside Maggie's bed, her expression grim. We dug deeper into Chelsea's background, Sarah said. What we found explains a lot about her desperation to get your house. She opened a file. Chelsea Martinez owes over $200,000 in gambling debts to some very unpleasant people. She's been running from them for 6 months, using different names, different cities. Brandon wasn't just her boyfriend, he was her escape plan. Maggie felt a chill. She was using him. Completely. The pregnancy might not even be real. We found medical records showing she's been on birth control continuously for the past year. The expensive medical bills Brandon was worried about. They were for cosmetic surgery and addiction treatment, not prenatal care. Sarah pulled out more documents. She's done this before, in Phoenix. She convinced an elderly man to sign over his house to her nephew, supposedly for tax purposes. When he tried to get it back, she disappeared with the proceeds from the sale. And Brandon had no idea, none. He was a mark, just like you were. She identified him as someone with access to valuable property and a psychological profile that made him susceptible to manipulation guilt about his mother, fear of financial failure, desire to be seen as a provider. Maggie closed her eyes, processing this information. Her son wasn't just her betrayer. He was also a victim, caught in a web of lies and manipulation that had cost him everything he'd thought he was protecting. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The mortgage application Brandon filed, it was going to fail anyway. Chelsea had already damaged his credit so badly that no legitimate lender would have approved it. This was always going to end in disaster. So what happens to her now? She's in the wind. Portland address was fake. But we've notified the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Women like Chelsea don't stop until they're stopped. She'll surface again. And when she does, there will be a warrant waiting." Sarah leaned forward. "Maggie, I know this doesn't undo what Brandon did, but it does explain why he did it. He wasn't just greedy or cruel. He was manipulated by someone who's very skilled at finding and exploiting people's vulnerabilities." Maggie thought about her son, crying on the porch as Chelsea drove away, about the months of lies and stress that had brought him to the point of betraying his own mother, about the woman who'd seen their family as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. "I need to see him," she said quietly. "Are you sure you're still recovering from—" "I'm sure. Whatever happens between Brandon and me, it needs to happen without her shadow hanging over it. He needs to know the truth about who he was really fighting for." Sarah nodded. "I'll call him. But Maggie, be careful. Forgiveness is healthy, but protecting yourself is essential." The competency hearing took place in a small courtroom that smelled of old wood and stale coffee. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 70s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes, presided over the proceeding with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible family drama. Brandon sat at the defendant's table alone, having dismissed his attorney. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. Across the aisle, Maggie sat with Sarah, medical records and witness statements spread before them. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Morrison said, "you filed a motion claiming your mother lacks the mental capacity to manage her own affairs. Do you wish to proceed with this claim?" Brandon stood slowly. "No, Your Honor. I withdraw the motion and all related claims. You understand that this dismissal is permanent. You cannot refile these claims at a later date." "I understand. I also want to formally apologize to my mother and to the court. My actions were wrong, and I take full responsibility for them." Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Thompson, the court appreciates your honesty. However, there's still the matter of the forged documents and fraudulent loan application. The district attorney's office has been notified." Sarah stood. "Your Honor, my client requests that charges not be filed against her son. She believes he was manipulated by a third party and that he's suffered enough." "Mrs. Thompson, do you understand that this means your son will face no criminal consequences for attempting to steal your house?" Maggie stood on shaky legs. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. But I also understand that my son is a victim in this situation, just as I was. The real criminal has already fled." Judge Morrison nodded. "Very well. The court will issue an order confirming Mrs. Thompson's full ownership of the property and her mental competency. All documents filed by Mr. Thompson are hereby declared null and void." As they left the courthouse, Brandon caught up with his mother on the steps. "Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but can we talk? Really talk? Without lawyers or legal papers or anyone else's agenda?" Maggie looked at her son, seeing both the man who'd betrayed her and the boy she'd raised. "Yes, Brandon, we can talk. But first, you need to understand something. I'm not the same person I was before this happened. And neither are you." They met at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory where neither of them had memories to complicate the conversation. Brandon arrived first, fidgeting with his coffee cup and looking like he hadn't slept in days. When Maggie entered, he stood awkwardly, unsure whether to hug her or shake her hand. "Sit," she said gently. "We have a lot to discuss." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Finally, Brandon spoke. "I know sorry isn't enough," he said. "I know I can't undo what I did or take back the pain I caused you. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was betraying you." Maggie studied her son's face. He looked older, beaten down by guilt and the realization of what he'd lost. "Tell me about Chelsea. From the beginning." Brandon's story poured out how he'd met Chelsea at a support group for people dealing with unemployment, how she'd seemed to understand his fears about providing for a family, how she'd gradually convinced him that his mother was the obstacle to their happiness. "She was so good at it," he said, his voice hollow. She'd say things like, "Your mother had her chance to live her life. Now it's your turn." Or, "She's old. She doesn't need all that space." She made it sound reasonable, like I was just claiming what was rightfully mine. And you believed her. I wanted to believe her. I was scared. Mom, scared of being poor, scared of failing as a father, scared of disappointing everyone. Chelsea offered me a solution that seemed to fix everything. Maggie felt a familiar pang of maternal instinct, the desire to comfort her child, to tell him everything would be all right. But she pushed it aside. This conversation needed honesty, not comfort. "Brandon, do you understand what you put me through? I didn't just lose my home. I lost my sense of safety, my trust in the person I loved most, my belief that I mattered to anyone." Brandon's eyes filled with tears. I know, and I hate myself for it. I lie awake at night thinking about you finding your things on the porch, about how alone you must have felt. I was alone, more alone than I'd ever been, even after your father died, because when he died, I still had you. When you threw me out, I had no one." The words hit Brandon like physical blows. He doubled over, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Mom, I don't know how to live with what I've done." Maggie reached across the table and took his hand. "You live with it by learning from it. By becoming someone who would never make that choice again. By understanding that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. Can you forgive me?" Maggie was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And it's not the same as things going back to how they were. I can't live with you again. Brandon, I can't trust you with my financial security or my physical safety. I understand. But I also can't write you off completely. You're still my son, and despite everything, I still love you. The question is, what kind of relationship can we have now?" Brandon wiped his eyes. "Whatever kind you're willing to give me. I know I have to earn back your trust, and I know it might take years, but I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." Maggie squeezed his hand. "Then we'll try, but slowly and with boundaries, and with the understanding that you're not entitled to my forgiveness, you have to earn it." 2 weeks later, Maggie stood in the doorway of the house she'd called home for 23 years. The rooms felt strange now, contaminated by betrayal and lies. Every corner held memories of trust broken. Every surface reminded her of documents forged and promises shattered. Sarah stood beside her, holding a folder of real estate documents. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "You could move back in. Make it your home again." Maggie walked through the living room, touching the mantel where wedding photos had once sat, the bookshelf where she'd displayed Brandon's school achievements, the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals. The house was beautiful, well-maintained, full of memories both good and bad. "I can't," she said finally. "I can't sleep in the bedroom where I used to feel safe, knowing that the son I raised was planning to steal it from me. I can't sit in the kitchen where we shared breakfast, knowing he was forging my signature on documents in the basement." She turned to Sarah. "I want to sell it, but not out of spite, and not to punish Brandon. I want to sell it because it's time for me to stop living in the past and start building a future." "What will you do with the proceeds?" Maggie had been thinking about this for days. "I want to establish a foundation, the Margaret Thompson Foundation for Elder Protection. We'll provide legal assistance, temporary housing, and advocacy for older adults who've been financially abused by their families." Sarah smiled. "That's beautiful and appropriate. I want you to serve on the board, and Pat Williams, and—" Maggie paused, then continued. "I want to ask Brandon to be involved too. Not in a leadership role, but as someone who can speak to potential perpetrators about the real cost of elder abuse. You think he'd be willing to do that? I think he needs to do it. For his own healing, and to help prevent other families from going through what we went through." They spent the afternoon with the realtor, discussing listing prices and marketing strategies. The house would sell quickly. It was in a desirable neighborhood, well-maintained, with good schools nearby. Everything a young family would want, as they prepared to leave. Maggie took one last walk through the rooms. In Brandon's old bedroom, she found something she'd missed before a photo of the two of them from his college graduation, tucked into the frame of his mirror. She looked young and proud. He looked hopeful and confident. Neither of them could have imagined where their relationship would lead. She slipped the photo into her purse. Some memories were worth preserving, even if they came with pain attached. Outside, she locked the door for the last time and handed the keys to Sarah. "I'm ready to go home now," she said. "Where's home?" Sarah asked. Maggie smiled. "I don't know yet, but I'm looking forward to finding out." The apartment Maggie found was small, but filled with light. Located in a complex designed for active seniors, it had a view of the community garden and walking trails that meandered through preserved woodland. Her neighbors were people like herself, retirees who'd chosen independence over isolation, activity over stagnation. She furnished the space simply a comfortable reading chair by the window, a small dining table for two, a bedroom with space for morning yoga and evening reflection. The walls held new artwork photographs from her travels, paintings by local artists, inspirational quotes that reflected her hard-won wisdom. Most importantly, she displayed the photo from Brandon's graduation, but in a new frame that included space for future memories. The past wasn't erased, but it was no longer the whole story. Pat Williams became a regular visitor, stopping by for coffee and updates on their growing foundation. The Margaret Thompson Foundation had received its non-profit status and was already helping its first clients, 3 women whose adult children had attempted various forms of financial abuse. "We're making a difference," Pat said during one of their morning meetings. "The woman from Springfield got her house back. The lady in Burlington has legal representation. And that gentleman whose nephew was stealing his Social Security, he's safe now." Maggie felt a satisfaction she'd never experienced before. Her pain had been transformed into purpose, her suffering into service. The Foundation's first major event was a community education seminar on elder financial abuse. Maggie had been nervous about speaking publicly, but when she saw the audience, dozens of older adults, their adult children, and professionals who worked with seniors, she felt empowered. "I'm not here as a victim," she told the crowd. "I'm here as a survivor, and I'm here to tell you that surviving isn't enough. We need to thrive." She told her story without shame or bitterness, focusing on the warning signs, the legal remedies, and the importance of setting boundaries with family members. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. During the question and answer session, a woman in the back raised her hand. "How do you forgive someone who's stolen your trust?" Maggie considered the question carefully. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing what happened. It's about refusing to let someone else's choices define your future. I forgave my son, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from the anger that was poisoning my life. After the seminar, she found Brandon waiting in the parking lot. He'd attended the event, sitting in the back row, listening to his mother transform their family's tragedy into a tool for helping others. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "And I'm grateful that you're using what I did to help other people." "Want to get coffee?" Maggie asked. "I'd like to tell you about my plans for the Foundation's next project." It was a small step, but it was forward motion, and for the first time in months, that felt like enough. 6 months after the Foundation's launch, Maggie was tending her small herb garden when Brandon arrived for their weekly visit. These meetings had become routine coffee, conversation, and slowly rebuilding trust through consistency and honesty. He looked healthier now, having found a new job and started therapy to address the anxiety and depression that had made him vulnerable to Chelsea's manipulation. More importantly, he'd begun volunteering with the Foundation, speaking to groups about the warning signs of financial abuse from the perpetrator's perspective. "I had a breakthrough in therapy this week," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I didn't just betray you, I betrayed myself. I compromised every value you taught me because I was afraid of feeling poor and powerless." Maggie nodded. "Fear makes us do terrible things, but it doesn't excuse them." "No, it doesn't. But understanding why I did it helps me make sure I'll never do it again." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon sun filter through the trees. Their relationship would never be what it had been before. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken. But it was becoming something new, something built on mutual respect rather than assumption, on choice rather than obligation. "Mom," Brandon said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but would you consider putting my name back on your emergency contact list? Not for financial decisions or legal matters, just in case you need someone to call." Maggie looked at her son, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the boy he'd been, or the betrayer he'd temporarily become. "I'll think about it," she said. "But not yet. We're still rebuilding." "I understand, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." That evening, Maggie sat at her small desk, writing in the journal she'd started keeping since the crisis. She wrote about forgiveness and boundaries, about the difference between love and trust, about the strength that comes from surviving your worst fears. Most importantly, she wrote about hope, not the passive hope that things would return to normal, but the active hope that comes from building something new and better from the ruins of what was lost. Outside her window, the community garden bloomed with the efforts of many hands. Each plant grew independently, but they all benefited from the shared soil, the common water, the collective wisdom of the gardeners who tended them. It was, she thought, a perfect metaphor for the life she was building. 1 year after its founding, the Margaret Thompson Foundation had helped 47 families and grown into a regional resource for elder protection. Maggie stood before the board of directors in their new office space, presenting the annual report with pride and satisfaction. "We've prevented an estimated $2.3 million in financial losses," she announced. "We've provided legal assistance to 31 victims of family financial abuse. We've helped 12 people regain control of their homes and assets. And we've educated over 3,000 community members about warning signs and prevention strategies." The board applauded, but Maggie's favorite part of the report was still to come. More importantly, we've helped 47 people reclaim their dignity and their right to exist as autonomous individuals. We've shown them that being older doesn't mean being powerless. After the meeting, Maggie walked through the foundation's offices, observing the work being done. Sarah Coleman led a legal clinic for seniors. Pat Williams counseled families through difficult transitions. A social worker Maggie had hired helped clients navigate complex service systems. And in the conference room, Brandon was running a support group for family members who'd committed financial abuse against their relatives. The group was controversial. Some people questioned whether perpetrators deserved support, but Maggie believed that preventing future abuse meant understanding why it happened in the first place. "The shame is overwhelming," she heard one participant say. "I can't believe I did that to my own father." "The shame is important," Brandon replied. "It means your conscience is working." The question is, what are you going to do with that shame? Are you going to let it paralyze you? Or are you going to use it to become someone who would never make that choice again? Maggie smiled. Her son had found his purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he'd made. It didn't undo the damage he'd caused, but it transformed his pain into something useful. That afternoon, she received a call from a woman in Seattle whose daughter had been stealing her Social Security checks. "I read about your foundation online," the woman said. "I don't know what to do. I love my daughter, but I can't afford to keep supporting her drug habit." Maggie spent an hour on the phone, providing resources, emotional support, and most importantly, validation that the woman's feelings were legitimate. "Love doesn't mean letting someone destroy you," she said. "Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that protect both of you." After the call, Maggie sat in her office, looking at the wall where she'd hung letters from people the foundation had helped. Each one represented a life reclaimed, a person who'd learned to value themselves enough to fight for their rights. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, frightened, betrayed, unsure of her own worth. That woman had been real, and her pain had been valid. But she was no longer that woman. She'd become someone stronger, someone who understood that survival wasn't enough, you had to thrive. The Foundation's second annual conference drew attendees from across the region. Families, professionals, and advocates gathered to share strategies for preventing elder abuse and supporting survivors. Maggie was scheduled to deliver the keynote address, but first, she wanted to observe the other sessions. In Workshop Room A, a family therapist discussed healthy boundaries between adult children and aging parents. "Love doesn't mean unlimited access to someone's resources," she told the audience. "It means respecting their autonomy and supporting their independence." Workshop Room B featured a panel of survivors sharing their stories. A man whose son had stolen his military pension. A woman whose daughter had forged her name on a reverse mortgage. A couple whose nephew had manipulated them into signing over their farm. Each story was different, but the themes were consistent: trust exploited, dignity violated, families destroyed by greed and desperation. But the most powerful session was happening in Workshop Room C, where Brandon co-facilitated a discussion about prevention from the perspective of potential perpetrators. The room was packed with adult children, grandchildren, and caregivers who wanted to understand how to avoid crossing the line from helping to harming. The first step, Brandon told the group, is recognizing that your parents are people, not resources. They have the right to make their own decisions, even if you disagree with those decisions. A woman in the audience raised her hand. But what if they're truly making bad choices? What if they're being scammed or spending money unwisely? Then you address it honestly and openly, Brandon replied. You don't manipulate or deceive. You don't act behind their backs. You treat them with the respect you'd want to receive. Another participant asked, what if they refuse help when they clearly need it? Then you accept that it's their choice to make. Brandon said, your job is to offer support, not to force it. The moment you start believing you know better than they do about their own lives, you're on the path to abuse. Maggie watched her son field these questions with wisdom born from painful experience. He'd learned these lessons the hard way, but he'd learned them thoroughly. During the lunch break, she found herself in conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a geriatrician who'd become one of the Foundation's medical advisors. Your son is remarkable, Dr. Chen said. Most people who've done what he did would either deny it or retreat into shame. Instead, he's using his experience to help others avoid the same mistakes. He's learned that the opposite of destroying someone isn't ignoring what you did, it's dedicating your life to preventing others from doing the same thing, Maggie replied. And how has this changed your relationship with him? Maggie considered the question. We're not mother and son in the traditional sense anymore. We're two adults who share a history and are choosing to build a future together. It's based on mutual respect rather than obligation. That sounds healthier than many family relationships I see. It is, because it's honest. We both know what we're capable of, the good and the bad. There are no illusions, no assumptions. Every interaction is a choice we make. That evening, as the conference concluded, Maggie and Brandon walked to their cars together. The conversation had been comfortable, focused on the Foundation's work and the positive feedback from attendees. Thank you, Brandon said as they reached his car, for letting me be part of this, for giving me a chance to turn what I did into something helpful. Thank you for doing the work, Maggie replied. For facing what you did instead of running from it. They hugged carefully, briefly, but genuinely. It was the first time they'd embraced since before the crisis, and it felt like a new beginning rather than a return to the past. The Foundation's impact extended far beyond individual cases. Maggie found herself testifying before the state legislature, advocating for stronger protections for older adults and increased penalties for family financial abuse. The current laws treat elder abuse as a family matter, she told the Joint Committee on Aging. But when someone steals from their parent or grandparent, it's not a family squabble. It's a crime that destroys lives and communities. The committee members, many of them middle-aged with aging parents of their own, listened intently as Maggie outlined the Foundation's recommendations, mandatory reporting requirements for financial institutions, enhanced penalties for family members who commit financial abuse, and increased funding for legal assistance. We're not asking you to criminalize family disagreements, she emphasized. We're asking you to recognize that older adults have the same rights as everyone else, the right to control their own assets, make their own decisions, and live free from financial exploitation. The bill that emerged from those hearings became known as the Margaret Thompson Act, and it passed with bipartisan support. Other states began adopting similar legislation, and Maggie was invited to speak at conferences across the country. But the work that meant the most to her happened on a smaller scale. The Foundation's weekly support groups brought together survivors who'd previously felt isolated and ashamed. They shared strategies for healing, rebuilding trust, and creating new relationships with family members who'd betrayed them. I thought I was the only one, A woman named Dorothy told the group, "I thought I'd failed as a mother because my daughter stole my retirement savings." "You didn't fail," Maggie replied. "You loved someone who took advantage of that love. The failure belongs to the person who chose to betray trust, not to the person who offered it." The group had become a family of sorts, people who understood each other's pain and celebrated each other's victories. They marked milestones together the first time someone felt safe in their own home again, the first time they trusted a family member with important information, the first time they realized they were more than just victims. Maggie's own healing progressed alongside theirs. She'd learned to separate her identity from her relationships, to value herself independent of whether others appreciated her. She'd discovered that strength wasn't about never being vulnerable, it was about surviving vulnerability and choosing to remain open to life's possibilities. Most importantly, she'd learned that dignity wasn't something others could give or take away. It was something you claimed for yourself, defended for yourself, and shared with others who needed to remember their own worth. 2 years after finding her belongings on the porch, Maggie stood in the same spot where her life had been shattered. The house had been sold to a young couple with twin toddlers, and the sound of children's laughter now filled the yard where she'd once felt such pain. Brandon stood beside her, holding a small plaque they'd come to install. The new owners had agreed to let them place a memorial marker in the garden, honoring the Margaret Thompson Foundation's work and the lessons learned from their family's crisis. "In memory of trust betrayed and dignity reclaimed," the plaque read. "May this space remind us that home is not a place, but a feeling of safety, respect, and love." As they worked together to install the marker, Maggie reflected on how much had changed. The foundation now operated in 6 states, helping hundreds of families navigate the complex intersection of love, money, and family obligation. Brandon had become a respected advocate, speaking at conferences and training programs about prevention and rehabilitation. More importantly, they'd both learned to live with their history without being defined by it. The betrayal had happened. The trust had been broken. The family had been shattered. But from those pieces, they'd built something new, a relationship based on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than assumption. "Do you ever regret it?" Brandon asked as they finished their work. "Fighting back instead of just accepting what happened?" Maggie considered the question. No, because fighting back wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about refusing to disappear. It was about insisting that I mattered, that my life had value, that I deserved to exist as a complete person. And now I know that I don't need anyone else's permission to matter. I don't need anyone else's validation to have worth. I matter because I choose to matter. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the young family play in the yard. The children had no idea that their playground had once been a battlefield, that their happy home had once been the site of profound betrayal and hard-won redemption. "The foundation wants to offer you a full-time position," Maggie said. "Director of Family Education and Prevention. It would mean traveling, speaking, developing programs. Are you interested?" Brandon's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in years. Yes, I'm very interested." "Good. Because I think you've finally found what you're meant to do with your life." As they walked back to their cars, Maggie felt a sense of completion. Not the completion of returning to the past, but the completion of creating something entirely new. She was no longer the woman who'd been thrown away, nor was she the victim who'd fought back. She was someone who'd transcended both identities to become exactly who she was meant to be. Behind them, the plaque caught the afternoon sun, its message visible to anyone who cared to read it. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to disappear.